Good morning. Welcome everyone to this session, Post-COVID Recovery and the Future of Global Economic and Social Governance, which is taking place in the context of commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1945. As you know, the last several months have been a very, very difficult time for people in the world, and in connection with the economic crisis brought about by COVID-19. I'm sure you have seen the forecast made for 2020 by both the IMF and the World Bank, which suggests a contraction of global GDP of something like 5% in 2020. My own expectation is that when the IMF releases updated forecasts in October, during the time of the annual meeting, the contraction may well be in excess of 5%. This has been the most intense crisis that we have suffered in the last 100 years, if one excludes the World War I or World War II. This is the largest contraction of GDP during peacetime of the last many, many decades. There was a report from the ILO a few weeks ago, which indicated that 1,600 million people, many of them working in the informal economy, had lost their jobs, as a result of which their income had come down somewhere between 60 and 80%. And this has no precedent, you know. We don't have data on informality for the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Because of high degrees of integration and hyperconnectivity, the lockdowns associated with the pandemic have been associated with a very sharp drop in immigrant remittances of something like 100 billion in 2020. Tax revenues have collapsed. Exports for commodity exporters in the developing world have shrunk in a very precipitous way. Foreign direct investment has come down in a major way as well. And you may have seen a report from the World Bank of a couple of months ago, suggesting that unfortunately we're going to have a great setback in 2020 in the fight against extreme poverty. The World Bank estimates that somewhere between 70 and 100 million people by the end of this year will have been added to the head count of extreme poverty. So the Sustainable Development Goal number 1, in fact, in 2020, we are going to be going in the opposite direction in terms of poverty alleviation. So for that reason, for all these factors, it is entirely appropriate that we meet today to discuss our current global economic and social governance and its particular relevance to the crisis that we're facing. For this, we have a very distinguished panel. Laura Chinchilla is Vice President of the Club of Madrid and former President of Costa Rica. Michael Moller is was Director General of the United Nations in Geneva and member of the board of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Jose Antonio Ocampo is a former UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs and professor at Columbia University. And Maria João Rodrigues is President of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, a member of the European Parliament, and a former Portuguese Minister of Employment. I would like to begin this session by posing a question that is actually directed to all the panelists. COVID-19 has found most countries, even high-income countries in many cases, with very unprepared public health facilities, and not enough hospital beds, not enough respirators, and other vital equipment. And so the question is, does the crisis suggest that we need to do a rethinking of social policies all over the world? And if so, in what direction? For instance, should we more aggressively pursue an increase in the coverage of health insurance and paid sick leave, so that we can align better the interests of workers with those of society. And furthermore, does the crisis suggest that we need to do a serious rethinking of our budgetary spending priorities, the structure of our budgets? Maybe we should be spending less money on subsidizing energy and more on public health and education and so on. So I would like to ask the panelists to address this question. And let's, for this first question, begin with Laura Chinchilla, and we'll take you up in alphabetical order. President Chinchilla.
Thank you very much, Augusto. I want to say that it is a pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the Club de Madrid with this very distinguished panelist. The first thing we should say is something very obvious, but it is important, again, to underline this situation, and it is that COVID-19 pandemic has displayed and highlighted the fractures and social gaps of societies, among them the deficiencies of social policies in general and health policies in particular. The pandemic seems to be an appropriate moment to remind ourselves that the center of any development policy should be human beings, that there is no more important asset than human capital, and therefore we must strengthen social policies, as you mentioned, particularly those tackling needs in education. We are going to have a huge impact on the youngest generation, employment and health. Countries with lower levels of human development are precisely those worst hit by the pandemic. In relation to health policies, I agree that increasing the coverage of health insurance and paid sick leave are instrumental for a positive change. But we could also consider some other policies, and let me just mention some of them. Universal health care systems, as it is in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, here in my country, Costa Rica. So we can be able to ensure all people have access to needed health services of sufficient quality, while also ensuring that the use of these services does not expose the user the financial hardship. Secondly, health policies should focus on the prevention of diseases and the promotion of a healthy lifestyle. We must remember that COVID-19 has shown no mercy for those with previous and serious health conditions, such as diabetes, hypertension, overweight, among others. Third, a key point has to do with promoting the sanitary basic infrastructure to millions of people deprived of it. Millions of people still do not have access to drinkable water and essential sanitary public services. So we must work towards guaranteeing global access to some medicines and treatments. And in that sense, I think we should be supporting the so-called COVAX, an effort to assure global equitable access to COVID vaccines. And to finalize, in order to be able to invest in all of these alternative policies, it is true that the governments need to take a hard look at the spending priorities, but also at the spending with greatest efficiency and integrity. And also, it is necessary to review how to finance public health and social policies and who will pay for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Chinchilla. Michael?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the president said pretty much most of it in terms of very practical aspects of it. I thought I'd maybe put it in a slightly broader context. And if there's one thing that this pandemic has shown is that the level of preparedness of governments, doesn't matter where they were, was vastly insufficient, in spite of the fact that we'd been told over many years that this kind of pandemic was coming. And in spite of that, and I'll come back to some of the reasons for that. But I think that specific, much greater attention to preparedness and prevention in a structural way that would allow for some much more organized and collaborative response to the next pandemic, which we are also being told right now will come sooner rather than later. So we are not, the mentality, the mindset of preparedness is not there. And it has something to do, of course, and we may come back to that later in the discussion, but the fact is that our political systems are short-term, and the solutions that we need to apply to the problems in front of us and the big challenges that we have are long-term. And these two have a hard time sort of connecting every now and then. So we need to rethink a little bit how we do our business, both at the international level and at the national level. There's one thing that this pandemic has shown very clearly is the absolutely extraordinary lack of cooperation and coordination, not just at the international level, but at the regional level, and even within countries. It doesn't matter how much you're going to change the health system and improving them, if you don't get your coordinating machinery right, as I said, both at the national and the international level, the impact of those preparations are not going to be as great as will be needed.
Thank you, Michael. Jose Antonio.
Well, thank you, Augusto, and thanks for the invitation to be in this fantastic panel today with such a fantastic company. Let me, of course, coincide with the previous statements and be very strong on the fact that this crisis has shown that there has to be universal social services, and health being possibly health being certainly one of those universal social services, and this includes, by the way, many countries that do not have universal health services. Actually, I live in one, the United States of America, which doesn't have universal health services, despite the reforms that were adopted a few years ago. There are other major social priorities. I mean, universal education, basic education is another priority. But I think, as you pointed out in the beginning, Augusto, the issue of employment and labor and income of the informal workers have come out as two strong priorities that should be at the center of any recovery strategy. How to generate more employment, how to support the households that don't have enough income. I mean, particularly those that are going back into extreme poverty. But even in general poverty, Latin America, for example, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean has estimated that there will be 36 additional poor in Latin America. We're going back 10 years in that process. So that is also a priority, certainly for our region. Now, for many countries, what this means is actually that they have to also increase government revenues. That is, taxes, tax revenues to finance the social programs. And this is, of course, a very important issue, which is in the international agenda. It means that the taxes have to give more revenue to finance programs, but they have also to be progressive systems so that they contribute to the redistribution of income in highly unequal societies like the ones we have in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And finally, Maria João Rodrigues, please.
Augusto, many thanks, and my greetings to my colleagues of the panel, a great panel, pleasure to be with you. I'm speaking from the European Union side, and look, I really think that the COVID crisis is a wake-up call for everybody to update social policies. When it comes to the European Union, it is certain that we have, let's say, a quite advanced European social model. Recently, we updated this model with something we call the European social pillar. I know this quite well because I was the European Parliament rapporteur on this. This was a big move, But now we are in front of something new, the COVID crisis. And what we have in Europe is not enough. Yes, we have quite universal access to healthcare. We have a high concern with the public health. We have sick leave paid, but this is not enough. We now see that we need to undertake a serious strengthening of our hospitals, of our care capacity. We have now a big initiative regarding the vaccine, and even today, our European Commission President announced an important global solidarity initiative about the vaccine. We want to save lives, but also to save jobs. Right now, we have in-depth discussion on how can we ensure more healthy working conditions, protecting workers from the pandemics. And then on the social protection, we know that we need to keep the access to unemployment insurance, the retirement pensions, including, I would like to underline this, to independent workers, informal workers. I think this is also very important from our viewpoint. And we are also concluding that we need to develop much more the care sector. So what I can tell you from the European side is that even if we don't have a quite advanced European social model, we see that many inequalities regarding the COVID impact, and we are now committed to undertake a serious update of our European social model.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria João Rodrigues. Actually, this comments, all of them very insightful and thoughtful, lead me to the next question. Jose Antonio Ocampo already referred to universal social services. He made a reference to basic education. Now, you, Madame Rodrigues, have brought into the discussion the whole question of solidarity and the plight of the underprivileged, informal workers, and so on. And so, perhaps it's not surprising that in recent months there has been a substantial sort of pickup in the discussion around, universal basic income. The idea that governments would provide, a safety net below which nobody in society would be allowed to fall. And in this discussion, I sometimes have been surprised by what I consider to be a not very honest debate about resource allocation. Sometimes we think that subsidizing energy or defense spending is sacred, cannot be touched, and so on. And so the whole question of affordability arises. Could we just say a few words, and I will restrict myself to Michael Moller and Madame Rodrigues on this issue before we go on to the next questions in the panel. Michael, briefly.
Well, there's already been mentioned by several of my co-panelists. But my problem with this is, first of all, universal basic income is something that predates the discussion and even the attempts to do so. A number of countries have tried it and let it down. My problem is with the word universal. What does it actually mean in this particular case? Because coming back to what both Jose Antonio and Maria João said, unless this is universal globally, unless this covers the low-income countries, the developing countries, who in themselves are not going to be able to implement a universal basic income simply because they can't afford it, and they don't get the help that is needed to do so, so that we have an equitable application of this policy, then I have a problem with it. But I think that the juries are still out on whether this is the way to go, and I'm not an economist, so I would rather have Jose Antonio speak about that. But I just want to make sure that we come up with solutions that are equitable, that are implementable, and that make sense in the very different economic and social contexts that this will be implemented.
Thank you. Maria João?
Yes, well, look, my comment on this is the following. First of all, let's have a look to the European experience. We have in many European countries something like minimum income schemes, which are there to protect those who fall into poverty or social exclusion, and for a reason or another, they cannot work or they cannot have access to a job. These are minimum income schemes. Then your question is about something which goes beyond the universal basic income. These will be extended to all citizens of each country. And I believe I'm a bit skeptical about this, I must say, because first of all, this is expensive. This might be expensive. This is complex. I think that on the long term, we should not exclude, because we are going to a new kind of economic system, which is not labor intensive. But my plea is that in the current situation of most of the countries, the best thing we can do is to work for full employment, is to provide good jobs for most of the people, because these will give us a reward, will be a meaningful activity, and also will finance the social protection we need to sustain on the long term. So for most of the countries, I think this remains the most powerful solution, is to have economic and social policies pushing for full employment. This is my comment.
All right, thank you.
Augusto, may I say something? Yes, excuse me, may I?
President Chinchilla, let me ask the next question to you, and then within your answer you can comment on this particular issue if you would like. But my question to you is actually specific to your own country's development experience. I'm a development economist, and I have this singular attraction to data. And I was looking at data on GDP for all the countries in Central America, beginning in 1950. In other words, a very long time series. And essentially, the story about Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras is as follows. If you go back to 1950, Costa Rica and Nicaragua had roughly the same income per capita, and El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras were somewhat behind, roughly at 60–70% of the level of Costa Rica. If you jump to the present and you look at 2019 figures, it turns out that Costa Rica's income per capita on a PPP basis is something like $18,000. Guatemala and El Salvador are at around $8,500 or so. And then Honduras and Nicaragua are around $5,300, $5,400, right? So what has happened in a 70-year period, roughly, is a huge divergence. Costa Rica has essentially taken off in very fundamental ways. And in fact, this is very much supported by other data. Costa Rica has the highest average life expectancy. It has the lowest infant mortality of the countries in this mention. It has the highest literacy rate, the highest spending on education, and the highest spending on public health. And if this was not enough, Costa Rica in all of Latin America comes way ahead in the World Happiness Index with a very respectable 12th place. So as a development economist, I find this very, very extraordinary and of course, very relevant to the discussion that we're having. Obviously, Costa Rica has done something well. And what I'd like to ask you very briefly, because this is a vast subject, and I'm sure especially you, given your role as former head of state, could speak to us for a long time. But what are the basic elements of Costa Rica's successful development strategy? What is it that in fact could be put forward as a model, not just for countries in Central America, but for the rest of the world as well? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this question. I will make an effort to answer it as short as possible. But I will start saying that the keys to Costa Ricans' happiness and well-being is that we have struck a balance between economic growth, environmental protection, social well-being, and something important, democratic consolidation. If you let me say something about each of the main pillars, I would start saying that regarding the economic growth, we have focused on our people, in our talent, that has entailed us diversifying our economy and making it more sophisticated. But those were decisions that were taken many years ago. For example, the decision to universalize the access to education was taken 140 years ago. So actually we are allocating 7% of GDP to public education, and 90% of the students go to public education. Health is also a universal access model and has worked quite well. We have the health indicators comparable to those of the developed world. Now, some of you must be asking, if you were a poor country more than 100 years ago, how were you able to finance those education and health systems? Well, we decided to abolish the army. And instead of spending our scarce resources in financing weapons or soldiers, we decided to finance schools and hospitals. The second pillar has to do with the environment. We understand that it is not possible to have a development if it is not sustainable. So again, more than 60 years ago, we decided to protect a third part of our small territory. We added some fiscal and financial instruments. So we have been able at this point to generate, for example, 100% of the energy from sustainable renewable sources. Very recently, when I was president, it was a national decision supported by most of the citizens to ban some kind of extractive industries such as oil, gas, gold. So we are not working with those resources. So, and finally, the political stability and democracy. We have invested in the quality of our institutions. So in short, I will say that this is the kind of vision behind the Costa Rican success. I mean, it's to understand that development is not only about economic growth, but it is the result of a very delicate balance between different kinds of variables.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that encouraging reply. Maria João, if you look at the data on income inequality, the Gini coefficients, which is this metric that economists use to capture a measure of inequality, the European Union happens to be the region of the world with the lowest Gini coefficients. Inequality is a problem today, which has mutated from simply an economic problem and has now become a big political issue as well. In many parts of the world, including Latin America, it's undermining the political order, it seems, as was made clear by the protests and street demonstrations in many Latin American countries in 2019, including Chile, by the way, which is seen as a very successful case of making the transition to high income status. Now, what is it about the European model that accounts for this encouraging result on the inequality side? I was a young economist in the IMF working on the Spanish desk many years ago, and I remember seeing how after Spain and Portugal joined the European Union, money started flooding in, not just from private investors, the transnational companies, establishing themselves in the Iberian Peninsula, but also from the European Union budget, because in European law, you have this undertaking to transfer resources from the richer countries to the poorer countries. If you just comment briefly on the European model, because it seems to me that it may be part of the solution. Maybe the answer is closer economic integration. Maybe it is the buildup of supranational institutions such as exist today in the European Union.
Well, Augusto, in fact, very important question. I will respond to your question, but let me underline, first of all, that part of the answer depends on what happens at the national level in many European countries. It is because we have tax systems which are quite progressive. Of course, we have differences. If you go to the Nordic countries, they are extremely progressive tax systems. But overall, in Europe, compared with the rest of the world, yes, we do have important tax systems playing a redistribution role. José Antonio Ocampo mentioned this some minutes ago, and this is a very important point. Now, on the top of this, yes, the European Union as such also has a powerful redistribution policy based on what we call regional development, regional economic and social cohesion policy. This is financed by the European budget, and this is providing not only loans, but grants to the European countries which need to catch up. And yes, I can confirm, first with Spain and Portugal, now with the Central and Eastern countries, these help a lot, these countries, to catch up and to have upward conversions for better economic and social standards. On the top of this, more recently, we are living, I believe, a kind of historical moment in Europe, because 2 months ago, we decided, exactly because of the COVID crisis, to take a further step on internal solidarity by launching a special fund for recovery to respond to the COVID crisis. And this special fund will give not only loans, but grants. But for the first time, this fund will be financed not only by national contributions coming from the member states, but will be financed by joint issuance of bonds. It took a long time for Europeans to agree on this, but the dramatic situation created by COVID has really forced to this exceptional measure. And let me conclude by saying that these special recovery fund will be financed by issue of bonds, which will be backed by new sources of taxation, particularly the digital tax and some kind of pollution taxes. So I think this is a very interesting experience. I hope this will really turn into reality. Now we are discussing the nitty-gritty of this. But why not to connect this discussion on another one we are having at the global level? How can we finance the Green Climate Fund? Because this fund is crucial to support all countries to make the green transition, but we still lack the resources. So let's have a look to this also.
All right. Thank you, Maria João. I think you highlight something very interesting about the European experience in general, which is that crises very often have been an opportunity to strengthen the institutions, to strengthen the process of economic and political integration, and I find that very encouraging. I myself am a firm believer that the rest of the world has a lot to learn from the European model. José Antonio, as was the case with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, governments have responded this year in multiple ways to come to the assistance of not just public health systems, but also workers, consumers, small and medium-sized companies. I won't describe, the full range of interventions that have taken place, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. I think all of us are familiar with that particular story because it has been widely reported in the press. At the same time, and this is my own sense, early in the crisis, maybe 3 months, 4 months ago, the IMF identified what they call the financing gap faced by the emerging markets and the developing countries. And it was this huge sum of $2.5 trillion for the next 12 months. And when I look at the data on what the international financial institutions have done so far, the IMF in particular, but also the multilateral development banks, in the first 6 months of the crisis, the figures are not especially encouraging. I know in the case of the IMF, they have disbursed up to early September something like $44 billion or $43 billion to some 80 countries, mainly in the developing world. And this accounts for less than 2% of this financing gap, which they themselves have identified. There was a discussion early on to do an SDR issue, which, as you know, Jose Antonio, was very successfully done in 2009 during the global financial crisis. But there seems to be no support for it this time around, even though the need this time around is 10 times greater than it was in 2008, 2009. So my question to you is, what's happening? Why does it seem, when you actually look at not the rhetoric, but the actual data, that the level of international solidarity, seems to be, fairly low. We haven't really done a great deal, to come to the rescue of countries in the developing world, especially. If you could comment on that, I think your experience is very relevant to this particular question.
Well, thank you very much for that question. Actually, let me say that actually, the Foundation of European Progressive Studies is publishing a paper I wrote exactly on this topic. And I did one actually for cooperation with Latin America, that was published by United Nations Development Program. And let me be very, very strong. The contrast between the international cooperation during the 2008-2009 crisis and the level of international cooperation during this crisis is striking. When you look back at 2009, for example, at the London Summit in April 2009, there was a huge decisions to include the issuance of SDR, the capitalization of the IMF, the reform of the IMF credit lines, the capitalization of all multilateral development banks, not using trade restrictions as an instrument of the recovery by countries, the beginning of international tax cooperation that was given to OECD, a much better international financial regulation. Anyway, this is the series of decisions that were taken in 2009. This time, the package of decisions is very limited. I mean, in the case of the IMF, essentially the United States vetoed the issuance of a special drawing rights. With others, we have proposed, in March, an issuance of, $500 billion. I mean, twice the amount that was done in 2009. That decision, again, was vetoed by the US with the surprising support of India. And now India changed its position later on. And I must say Europe also on the side of the issuance of the special drawing rights. So Europe was on the right track, let's say, in that decision. Now, in the case of the IMF, as you mentioned, the only important thing that has happened are the emergency credit lines that have been given to about 80 countries. That has been a very good decision, but it's very little money because the amount that can be lent has a maximum of the, let's say, the contribution of the country to the IMF. so it's very little money, as you say. It's a bit more than $40 billion, which is, compares actually with the 100 billion for that facility that the managing director had proposed, and with the $2.5 billion or billion dollars that she said that were needed for the emerging and developing countries. In the case of multilateral development banks, I must say is striking. There has been no call by the G20 to capitalize multilateral development banks, which was a major source of financing during the recovery during the previous crisis. I mean, fortunately, the World Bank and the African Development Bank had been recently recapitalized. But for example, in our region, the Inter-American Development Bank has not been capitalized. Without that, it will not be able to increase financing. And it took, in my view, a terrible decision last Saturday to elect a U.S. citizen as president, which I think, given the political divisions in the United States, is likely to give to no capitalization of the Inter-American Development Bank. In terms of international tax cooperation, the negotiations are going on, but they're very limited. The World Trade Organization is a huge crisis associated to the trade war between the U.S. and China, where the head of WTO resigned, and there is a process of choosing. The dispute settlement mechanism, which was, in my view, the best mechanism of dispute settlement in the international system, ceased to work in December. Anyway, we can continue, but the essence of the story is international cooperation during this crisis has been minimal. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Your answer is a very compelling one, and I think it echoes very much what we have, of course, learned over the last 6 months from media reports and other decisions made at the official level. President Chinchilla, I want to come to an issue with you that has been of great interest to me. I have had an interest on gender issues and gender equality for much of my professional career, and one of the fascinating aspects of this crisis is basically how COVID-19 seems to have highlighted the success of women-led governments in addressing the crisis. The data really is quite compelling. In the world today, roughly 8% of either prime ministerial or head of state positions are in the hands of women leaders. We are still in a very male-dominated world at the upper levels of power. And yet, these countries led by women account for 40% of the successful cases of managing the crisis. I'm talking about Finland, Germany, Iceland, New Zealand, Norway, Taiwan, and there are others as well. If you look at the mortality rates in those countries run by women, they are 6 times lower than the mortality rates of the other countries run by men, and so on. I could share more data with you, but I think you get the point. What is it about women-led governments? Is it that they have basically relied on the advice of experts and scientists? Is it that they have been more flexible and more transparent and more honest with the population in terms of the repercussions of COVID-19? There is obviously something very interesting going on here that may have implications, not just for management of this public health crisis, but for governance more generally. And since we are talking today about social and economic governance in a post-COVID-19 world, I think this issue is of critical importance. So I will ask you to comment briefly on this, and I will also ask Maria João to say a few words on this as well. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm very glad to try to respond to this question. I will add something else to the figures that you gave us, and it is that it is even more interesting the fact that almost 100% of governments being headed by women have managed pretty well the pandemic situation. Now, let me begin by saying that there are three main variables that combined together, I think that can better explain the changing dynamics of management, the COVID pandemic. One is the quality of institutions. Secondly, the quality of citizenship, which means civic values and political culture. And finally, the quality of leadership. And starting from there, the first thing to be highlighted is that those female leaders represent nations with strong institutions, solid democracies, and high levels of human development. So it is very clear that those factors are working in their favors. And also, those leaders may be the products of the types of societies that have invested more in the values of social inclusion, which are therefore more likely to elect leaders based on criteria than on just being male. However, also we have to recognize that not all democracies with the same levels of human development have been able to manage well the pandemic. Therefore, I think that there are also some explanation in the case of these examples about female leadership, about the quality of leadership that they represent. And so in that sense, let me just try to give some keys in terms of the features that are usually associated with women leadership. And I will mention at least three kind of features. The first is a kind of combination of humbleness, if I will put it in those words, humbleness with respect and discipline. Women tend to display a distinctive approach to power. So it is a less arrogant attitude, much more willing to listen and to confirm policy with respect and discipline to technical and scientific criteria. And this is a moment where politicians have been forced to abide, like probably never before, to science. So I think that is part of the success. Secondly, empathy. Women have an increased ability to identify with others people's feelings and needs. And this is also a moment where the conditions of leadership, such as compassion and solidarity, are being put to test. And I think they have been also an example of this. And finally, women's typically collaborative leadership style is well suited to coalition building and dialogue, much necessary conditions in moments in which leaders need to engage in a day-to-day conversation with sectors and with population at large. So I will say that probably those more kind of specific features of female leadership explain, among the other factors, the success that they are having in dealing with the crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very, very compelling and eloquent response. It cheers my heart. Maria João.
Look, let me say, first of all, that I fully agree what Laura just said. She was very clear on this explanation, and I just had a couple of points. One is somehow women are particularly sensitive to this new concept about well-being, which is more than just growth. And bringing together the different dimensions of reality, for them, I think the SDGs agenda is a natural thing. We need to put together the economic, the social, the environmental. We perhaps have a special sensitivity to the concept of health, of life. And I like particularly the concept of One Health, because now, also because of the COVID crisis, we understand that humankind is just part of nature and of the planet. And we need to reset our relationship with nature and the planet according to this one health concept. If the planet is unhealthy, we cannot be healthy, and vice versa. So this is a natural thing for women, of course, to understand. But the point I'd like to make is that, of course, men can also understand. Men can also understand, but it can help a lot if we empower women at all levels in all fields of action. And we still have a long way to go in this direction. But this is so clear. This is the direction to be taken.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I very much like the fact that both of you have emphasized the notions of empathy and solidarity, and why not say it, the concept of the unity of mankind. You know, we're all part of one human family, and I think the pandemic has very much shown, you know, how closely integrated we are and how interdependent we are from each other. Michael, if I could come to you for a couple of minutes, can you comment on the issue of sort of deficient governance structures at all levels, and the manner in which the current pandemic has highlighted the need for different approaches in how we should run the affairs of our planet? A question which goes, of course, well beyond the attempts to create the conditions for better management of future health crises, as well as financial crisis.
This is where the 2-minute answer becomes a bit of a problem, but let me try. Let me first say something, though, a sort of a general comment. I think one of the things that worries me, and it's linked to this over the last several months, as we discuss how we are going to learn the lessons from the pandemic, how we're going to move forward, is that in many of these conversations that I participate in, and in articles I read, etc., the tendency is to come up with solutions that are solidly rooted in the past. So we come up with solutions that are within the frameworks of the structures that we have had for many decades, with a kind of mindset that we have had before this happens. And we are now in a situation where we need to turn our face towards the future. One very small example of that is the sort of hashtag or slogan that is being used all over the place, including by the UN, that we need to build back better. I disagree with that. I think we need to build forward better. We are not going to go back, and we shouldn't go back. And I don't think that reality will allow us to go back, because there's so much that has happened in the last few months. Now, in terms of governance, I mean, clearly the transition in governance that we have been in for quite a while now, at all levels of society, predates the COVID pandemic. It's just that I think, as with many other aspects of the way that we do things, it has accelerated, first of all, highlighted the deficiencies that we are functioning with, and that have in part are at the root of some of the calamities that we're living with right now, but also highlighted some of the solutions and some of the tools that we can use. You know, it's clear to me certainly that that we're moving towards a much more polycentric, multi-stakeholder, whatever we're going to end up calling it, style of governance, whether it's at the international, global level, or whether it's a regional, national, communal, etc. There will be other people around the decision-making tables and governance. And it is quite clear that if we continue to believe with excuses to those of you who have been or are in government, if we continue to believe that we can let all of these problems that we're faced with, sort of major existential problems, just in the hands of governments, we are not going to make it. A lot of different parts of our societies are now taking part in the search for solutions, and they're very actively participating in applying them. And add to that the onslaught, I would call it, of technology. We have been living an extraordinary rapid development of technology over the past several years. And I think that the pandemic has quite frankly, leapfrogged at least 10 years into our lives with the way that we use technology on all aspects of our lives practically. And that will continue, and that will be part of the solutions that we're going to have to apply to find a new way of doing things. I think it's a matter of mindset change here at all levels of our societies. It is happening already. I'm seeing it certainly here in Geneva, where you have the, if you want, the operational center of the international system, where you're seeing more and more this kind of search for a new kind of multilateralism, a much more networked, much more integrated, much more collaborative, much less siloed way of managing our affairs and of doing business, and with surprising results, frankly. It's now coming to people's attention with some surprise at times that it's better to work together than not. The impact of the individual and collective solutions is much greater. And we are now seeing here more and more readiness to share and to integrate our different and leverage our different strengths in order to get to where we need to go. I refer to the sort of structural problem that to me is an increasing problem between short-term political systems and long-term solutions that we need to apply to these big existential problems that are ahead of us. The bridge to bridge that gap is made up of a multi-stakeholder system, and certainly also made up of the United Nations, if it manages to get itself reformed in a way that will truly be able to face these huge challenges that we are standing in front right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Jose Antonio, if I could come back to you, picking up on some of the points made by Michael, and in particular, building up on some of the things that you said about the inadequateness of international cooperation, in the current crisis compared to 2008, 2009. Is there an urgent need for an overarching or integrated gradual recovery strategy for COVID-19? And if so, what would be some of the characteristics of this strategy? Can you suggest a few ideas on specific ways that you feel the global and economic social governance system could be further improved?
Well, let me start by underscoring that the most important issue by far is probably in the area of health. So not only facilitating tests throughout the world, which they are still very scarce in many parts of the world, but when there is a vaccine, how to guarantee access to that, the effective vaccine throughout the world, which also has to do with the very, important issue of intellectual property rights over the vaccines, and the possibility of having exceptions to the rules of intellectual property rights that they should be adopted, which is formally a decision of WTO, because the intellectual property right regimes is embodied in WTO. There was actually an exception in the health area that was agreed in 2001, and something like that will probably be required. That's one point. Then the second issue, which is very, very important, is the issue of financing. Financing to both middle income and low income countries, because in both cases, you have a lot of constraints on the amount of spending that they can do to manage the crisis and to overcome the crisis, which I pointed out before, is above all an issue of employment generation and support to the poor households, which are two overriding priorities now and in the immediate future. Now, what are those mechanisms? How to do more active IMF programs that allow for increasing the fiscal deficits during the crisis is one issue. I mean, so more regular programs than the emergency program that have already been approved. And even more important, a significant expansion of the multilateral development bank lending, which was actually done during the 2009-2010. We need something like that, which was very, very useful at that time. It should be equally useful today. And there probably have to be special funds to support, very vulnerable countries because they are very poor, let's say the least developed countries, but also because they are, very vulnerable. I mean, for example, the small islands that are tourist centers are in a total collapse. How to support them in some way is important. And let me finally mention the issue of debt. The decision this year was to approve a debt mechanism that allowed the postponement of payments of debt for low-income countries, but only for this year. And it was expected to have a participation of the private sector, and the private sector has not come into that. So it's only official financing that is, part of the solution. There has to be, first of all, a mechanism that actually, extends that into next year at least, but also allow other countries to go into a similar mechanism. Again, for example, the vulnerable countries such as the small island, tourist centers will probably have to come in to that solution, and maybe a broader mechanism for voluntary, not really renegotiation, but it's actually in many cases just postponing the payments that are due during the crisis in order for the governments to have more fiscal resources to expand the spending. And I will finish with this. There has also been the long-term issue of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. So a formal institutional mechanism where countries can actually negotiate with private creditors their debts when they have problems. I mean, today that is done through one-by-one negotiations, such as the one, for example, that were done by Argentina and Ecuador recently in Latin America. But there has to be a more formal mechanism, which has been a proposal on the table. There was an attempt actually in the IMF to, about 10 years ago, to introduce a mechanism that would then, the negotiations were actually a failure. But there has to be a new mechanism of renegotiation, institutional one, which I think could be either in the United Nations, or I will accept the IMF if the dispute settlement mechanism is totally independent of the IMF board. With that, particular restriction, I think it could be located in the IMF.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. I'm looking at the watch, and I'm also compelled by the organizers of this event to give an opportunity for people to ask questions during the balance of the webinar. Therefore, I will come back to you, all four of you, with one final question, and you can comment on this particular question, or you can use your 1 minute, just 1 minute per panelist, to comment on any other outstanding issues that may have been left on the table as a result of this very interesting set of discussions. After the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, there was an attempt to redefine financial stability, the term financial stability, basically saying it is not enough to focus on price stability. The concept of financial stability has to include things like asset booms, leverage, and other aspects of the financial system which can undermine its stability if they're not working well. Should we rethink the meaning of security and basically to reframe that concept in terms of human security and social and economic well-being, rather than sort of the traditional militaristic approaches to security and national defense? So you can either comment on that or any other issue that you want. You have each 1 minute, and I will begin with, well, Jose Antonio.
Well, let me really refer to the original concept of financial stability. I think there are two essential issues. The first one is to have employment as a major objective of macroeconomic policies, which, by the way, is an improvement. I mean, the U.S. Fed, for example, has just underscored employment as a overriding objective. I think that should be a policy of all central banks in the world, and certainly of national governments. And the other is the issue of how to manage financial instability, basically the volatility of finance, as we say in economics, the boom-bust cycles of finance. And the IMF actually adopted in 2012 what they call the institutional view on that topic. That is, which allows for capital controls, let's say, when you have severe instability facing countries. And of course, reinforcing financial regulation and supervision, which was another agreement of the G20 in 2009. I think all of those management of financial instability should be certainly part of the agenda. But I will underscore the issue of employment as a major objective of monetary policy, as well as central government policies.
Thank you. Maria João, your last 1 minute comment.
Look, let me build what Jose Antonio just said. I completely agree. Employment should be at the center. But my point is the following. We are speaking about recovery to respond to the COVID crisis, but we need much more than recovery. We need to transform the way we live. So these big recovery packages must be used to push for green transition and making the best of the digital transition also. But for this to work, we need to have a deep sense of social fairness. Only fair solutions will bring us to a kind of new green economy and making the best of the digital transformation. So that's why I do think that the United Nations system, the multilateral system as a whole, needs to work in another way. SDGs remain a central reference, but we need to have the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, aligning with these goals. Otherwise, these would not fly. And for this, we need to have a big political push. And the big political push should be based on the coalition of forces, all countries, all civil society, all citizens, wherever they are, pushing exactly for this goal. And allow me to say that we in Europe, we are also working hard for this. And we just completed, by the way, a report on renewing multilateralism, which will be presented also on Friday as a good complement of the excellent book by Augusto Lopez-Claros.
Thank you, Maria João. Martin, 1 minute, please. Michael.
I will answer your question, and the answer is an emphatic yes. We have to completely rethink what we mean by security. And the answer is, as Maria João just said, lies first and foremost in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, our global roadmap. If you manage to implement those in an integrated way, then you will have security. But it has to go. It's a deep reform and a deep engineering, if you want, structural engineering that needs to happen, starting, if you want, by the Security Council. The Security Council has to understand that if it wants to be truly the defender of peace and security of the planet and on every citizen, it has to completely rethink the way it looks at security. Security is not just, as you say, as you said in your question, an issue of military and an issue of armaments and an issue of, it's a deeply social, economic, cultural element that we need to look in a very much more coherent and integrated way. So the answer is yes, we have to rethink it. And we have to not just rethink it, we have to reapply it in every single sphere of governance that we have at all levels.
Thank you, Michael. President Chinchilla, please, you are the last. 1 minute. You are muted. You need to unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, excuse me, here I am. No, first of all, I totally endorse the comments that are being made by the three panelists. What I'm not sure is if we should try to reinvent a concept or if we have to take it seriously, because in 1990s, the UNDP came out with the concept of human security. So the challenge is to think holistically across issues as historically separate as security, economics, and politics, to take that approach very seriously, because people live in an integrated reality and we must respond to insecurity, even the anxieties caused by the uncertainty in its many forms. So as I mentioned earlier, the importance of broadening our economic scope to focus on human development and well-being is very important. So again, our best hope for integrated human development at present continue to be the Agenda 2030 sustainable goals. So we cannot allow the pandemic and its aftermath to distract us from the realization. And just to finish, I also want to say that the short and the long term start at the same time. So the decisions that government and international organizations are taking today are going to impact the recovery phase and the future situation of humanity. So the right decisions have been taken right now. Thank you.
Thank you, President Chinchilla. I will take up some of the questions that have come in. And one question addresses the issue of what has been happening to government revenue in the middle of this pandemic. As you know, GDP has collapsed throughout the world. At least in 2008 and 2009, some of the emerging markets continued to grow. But now the situation is much more dire. Debt levels are sky high, wartime debt levels. And so the question basically comes from someone who says, how are we going to be able to respond to the needs of the moment in a context of much reduced fiscal space? Jose Antonio, very briefly, if you could comment on this, given your experience, give us a 1 minute summary, how you see us coming out of this situation.
Well, the tax revenues are collapsing everywhere. And a large part of the increase in the debt ratios of countries, which is also a universal trend, as you pointed out, or the question points out, is also a significant trend, particularly when there is a significant amount of spending, which is more a question of developed countries that developing countries, which have more limitations on how much they can spend. Now, this means that the issue of security, part of the recovery of taxation will come with the recovery of the world economy. And hopefully it will be strong again everywhere. But I think in many cases, we have to think seriously about the improvements in taxation systems, international cooperation in tax matters, which is the topic being discussed in the OECD inclusive framework, and try to think of raising significant amount of taxes next year through a very redistributive mechanism, which, by the way, some millionaires of the world have pointed out that they should be taxed. I mean, the idea of tax exemptions as the solution to the current economic crisis is something that has to be overcome. I think much more important than that is securing enough tax revenues in a progressive way to support many of the social programs that would be needed during the recovery.
Thank you. President Chinchilla, there's a question for you. If you could discuss very, very briefly, because we're running out of time, we need to close because there is another session coming up at 12 o'clock. The role of the demilitarization of Costa Rican society and the extent to which this was part of the successful strategy of development in the last 50, 60 years. People are interested in knowing your particular perspectives on this issue.
Well, yes, as I said, the first important consequence was the possibility that a country with very scarce resources was able just to reallocate those resources in favor of human development. So that was the first consequence of the decision. But looking at the long term and speaking from the point of view of the Latin American context, where military, instead of being a guarantee of stability, they have been a factor of destabilization to democracy. Costa Rica also profited from this decision because when we decided to demobilize the army, those were the years of military gear here in our region. So in a certain way, we vaccinated the institutions against the military and the authoritarian temptation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Michael, a question which I will direct to you. Jose Ingram from Canada, a former colleague of mine at the World Bank, asks the following. Global warming and climate change will shift very much into the center of our political and economic debates in coming years. What is the likely impact of this on our conception of liberal capitalism as the foundation of the global economy?
Well, first of all, I think that it's not going to come into the center of our conversations. It already is, and if you know, in asymmetric ways, but it's certainly the number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Many numbers down the list of priorities for all of us, and if it isn't, it should be. How liberal capitalism is going to be able to deal with it, I think the answer almost gives itself. I mean, you know, unless we harness all the resources that we have in order to lick this problem, we are not going to. We're simply not going to make it. Don't ask me about this. Is more a question for Jose Antonio in terms of the mechanics of how our economies are going to adapt to the increasing demands of financing for licking the problem of climate. But it's, to me, it's not. It's too narrow a question. The way that we're going to deal with the climate change is not just a financial issue. It's not just an economical issue. It's a question of will. It's a question of social cohesion. It's a question of a vastly increased global solidarity. It's a question of massive collaboration amongst all of us, small and big. And certainly it's a question of us in the rich part of the world showing much greater solidarity, empathy, and help to those countries that at the end of the day are going to be the ones that are going to be most affected by what's happening now.
One last question to you, Mary João. Dmitry Chumakov, who is a Russian representative in the UN delegation in New York, asks whether it is possible to come out of the COVID-19 crisis without a substantial reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, which in his view probably have remained somewhat frozen in time and are struggling with the current crisis.
Well, many thanks for this question. I do think that we need to have in-depth reform of the Bretton Woods institutions. First of all, to make sure that they are perceived as really representing all countries in the world. And this should be translated, I believe, somehow in their leadership. And the same happens with WTO, by the way, because we can have bit of ideas with the SDGs agenda. And this is an agenda to support development everywhere. But if we don't have the financial tools to make this work, this will be blocked. And this means that somehow we need to organize a kind of redistribution. From my viewpoint, this also involves taxation. And I don't agree with those who are saying we don't have the resources. Yes, we have the resources because we have new sources of wealth creation. Let me just point one is the